Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, his book is called Growing Up Star Wars. Kevin Doherty explains all about his lifelong obsession with the film property. I mean, it's the universe, I guess, Kevin, more than just the film.
Well, the book really is more about how it affected me and my life and how it continues to do so. Here I am as a 50-something-year-old adult, and it's still timeless to me.
Would this book have happened if the sequels, like if episodes 1, 2, and 3 hadn't happened? Because in reading the book, I get the sense that like that kind of, it's not that your like fandom was nascent, but it like really re-energized it.
The energy never really went away. But I would say, it's fair to say that it definitely re-energized things. I mean, in the dark times there, when Star Wars kind of disappeared off the face of the map right after Return of the Jedi, it kind of petered out and it just wasn't talked about, right? Like Star Wars kind of fell off the face of the earth for a while there. And then in 87, when it had its 10th year anniversary, my best friend Trevor, who I write a lot about in the book, who introduced me to Star Wars, he and I got together and had a quiet little 10-year celebration and celebrated the 10 years. And we did a lot of reminiscing that night. Just the two of us got together and talked about all the stuff that we went through, which is chronicled in the book. And we really thought that when we were doing that we were probably the only people on the planet Earth that was acknowledging Star Wars 10th year anniversary. We really thought we were the only ones because Star Wars was gone. Nobody talked about it. We were a little older. We matured a lot. Our interests changed. But Star Wars never really went away in my life like it did throughout the world there in the late 80s and the early 90s until the Timothy Zahn novels came out. I guess if you're looking for a re-energization point, that might have been it too, when the Zahn novels came out and the Dark Horse comic series came out. And some more stuff started getting available. And then the prequels, that just kind of sent things through the roof for me.
So the Zahn novels and the Dark Horse comics, I mean, that kind of starts to suggest like the notion of like a universe, right? Like that the Star Wars, episodes 4, 5, and 6 exist within this like larger context and a bigger story.
Mm-hmm.
Were you like deep into those books, or did you kind of like, because I know some people who are like, oh, it's only what happens on the big screen that necessarily matters.
I was one of those. Yeah. I wasn't deep into the books, but because it was Star Wars and it was new material, of course I bought them and I read them, but not nearly as captivating, And I always had that in the back of my mind that the OG was, to me, the Bible, right? But it was new Star Wars material. And the Marvel comics, last issue was 107, and that was in 1986. So the expanded universe continued, but the interest just wasn't there. And Marvel canceled their series after 106 or 107, and then it just died out. But because there was new material, there was hope, I guess, that maybe that episode 1, 2, and 3 might happen someday, and it ended up happening, which, like I said, blew the roof off. But yeah, I was, but I did enjoy the Dark Horse series, though. That was fun. I mean, there was really, really cool artwork in that, and it was really, really faithful to the actors' likenesses too, and that really blew me away. The artwork was beautiful, and it was very colorful. But the Zahn novels, I read them, but I quickly forgot what happened in them.
The artwork in the Dark Horse, that brings me to something that you certainly take issue with, the way that Marvel comics like shoddy representation of the characters.
Did I ever? Yeah. It was horrendous. And it wasn't just me. I mean, my friends that bought the comics too just couldn't understand why the artists couldn't get the actors' likenesses right. It was mind-boggling. It was embarrassing. And I know I covered that a lot in the book, and Trevor did write a scathing letter to Marvel. But it's funny because when I started writing the book, I got my old collection out and I started leafing through them and reading like the letters sections of each issue. And there was a lot of complaining about the art. So it wasn't just me and Trevor. It was there was a large chunk of us that just couldn't understand why the artwork was so crappy.
You mentioned Trevor a couple times there. He's the one who got you to watch the film in the first place.
Yeah, he was very persistent. It was, and I chronicle this again in the book too. Is in the second grade in September, he was sitting beside me, and I didn't know who he was, but he was busy drawing space battles and spaceships and stuff. And I wasn't into space. I was into the Bionic Man, and I was into kung fu and SWAT and all that 70s stuff. And I had no interest in science fiction. And he saw me looking over at him drawing his little spaceships, and then he asked me if I had ever seen Star Wars, and I said no, I hadn't even heard of it. And then he just went on a tangent and started telling me all about the robots, the aliens, and the spaceships. But I wasn't interested. I was happy with my Bionic Man, and watching Batman, Adam West all the time. That's all I needed in my world. I wasn't interested in bringing anything else in because I had a lot going on as it was. But he persisted and asked me every single Monday, did your dad take you to see Star Wars on the weekend? Did your dad? No. And I never asked him to take me. I just wasn't interested. And he pestered me to the point where I would just spite him and say, yeah, I asked him and he said he can't take me. So thinking it would end there. But as I related in the book, he ended up coming to my house with his dad. And I was upstairs in my bedroom playing around, and my mom called me downstairs saying, there's somebody here with their father. And I was terrified because anytime an adult was involved in anything, that meant you were in trouble, And I'm like, what? Who's here, and why is his dad with him? Like, what did I do? And I was terrified. And when I saw that it was Trevor and his dad, I thought, my God, is it coming to this? Like, is he going to get his dad after me? Like, geez, like, give me a break here. Like, give me some room. And then my mom said, yeah, Trevor's here to ask you if you want to see Star Wars with his dad tomorrow. And I thought, well, there's no turning back. I can't say no, not to an adult. I don't want to get in trouble. So I said, yeah, I guess I'll go. And he dragged me to it on the Saturday there. And it was in October. Star Wars was released in Winnipeg June 26th, so about a month after it was released in the States. So it had been around for a while. But I had heard nothing about it, and I wasn't interested, and I didn't want to go because I was a mama's boy, and I didn't like doing anything without my mom and dad. And I was 8 years old, and I had never done anything by myself before. And here I was in the care of of Trevor and this strange man, his dad. I'll never forget that first day. I'll never forget what I wore. I'll never forget my mom tucking the $5 bill in my pocket to pay for my admittance and my popcorn, and walking to his house and playing in his backyard, waiting to go, and his neighbors playing Nerf football next door and tossing the football around, and landed in Trevor's yard, and I picked it up, and they were teenagers, and they knew we were going to see Star Wars, and they were teasing us and razzing us about it, and it terrified me because I thought, well, I don't want to be teased, and I don't want people to know I see Star Wars if this is what's going to happen. But no, Trevor was persistent. And he said, if you don't see Star Wars, you'll be the only person in the world that hasn't seen it, and they're going to laugh at you. And off we went to the King's Theater in their blue Maverick. And I was terrified when I got there because there was a massive lineup, and I had never been around that many people before in one public area without my mom and dad. I was terrified. I was hoping that we wouldn't get in. And when we got in, it was even more terrifying because the theater was loud. It was boisterous. It was like a rock concert atmosphere. Like everybody was laughing and hooting and hollering because a lot of these people had already seen it and they were excited to see it again. And here I was, like this, absolutely frightened, out of my wits, 8-year-old sitting in a theater with a bunch of strangers. And I wanted to cry. Like I wanted mom and dad there. But when those curtains opened and the movie started, I was lost and forever transformed after that. It's cliched, and you hear everybody talk about how, yeah, the opening sequence with the Star Destroyer coming overhead and stretching forever, and oh, it blew my mind, and my life was changed. Well, that's how I describe it too, because it really did blow my mind. I had never been in a movie theater, so I didn't know what I was getting into. I'd been to the drive-in before. I know my dad had taken us to see some Pink Panther movies, a couple of double-headers, but I didn't know what I was getting into, and I was terrified. But it was the greatest day of my life. I'm glad Trevor persisted like he did, and I'm glad he dragged me to it.
You mentioned that you can still remember what you wore that day and everything, like the details.
Mm-hmm.
How much did you keep diaries or write things during, like, over the time, or is it just like
No,
you have just such a great memory you can recreate these situations?
no. Trevor and I, since that day, we grew up together. We went through our teens together. We went into adulthood together. He was the best man at my wedding. And we are a couple of sentimental saps. Like, nostalgia is our thing. Even back then, we always talked about the good old days. Even when we were kids. Like, remember that first day we saw Star Wars, and remember. So we constantly talked about the things that happened to us when we were younger, and we always talked about it when we were teenagers. We always talked about it when we were adults. And like I said, when we got together for that 10-year anniversary get together, we reminisced all night, and so the memories always stayed fresh in my mind.
So you've kind of practiced your memory in some sense.
Yeah, like constantly reliving it and constantly reminiscing with Trevor. The memories were always constantly fresh.
So how did that help in terms of writing this book? Like, did you have a strong sense of kind of like the linearity of things and how to tell this, or did you start kind of like mapping out what chapters would be? Like, how did you kind of draw on that reminiscence to make this book?
The idea for the book started about 6 or 7 years ago. I was at work, and a bunch of coworkers and I were standing around talking about movies that had the best plot twists of all time, like movies that pulled the rug out from underneath you. And the usual movies were brought up, like The Sixth Sense and the others, Soylent Green, Planet of the Apes. And we were just kind of rifling off a bunch of titles that just blew us away. And I mentioned The Empire Strikes Back. And the coworkers that I was with at the time, they were maybe 6 or 7 years younger than I was. And one of the coworkers looked at me kind of shocked and said, "What was so shocking about that?" And I said, "Well, when Darth Vader tells Luke he's his father, duh. Like, what do you..." And because they grew up with that already established and had already known, they didn't know what a jaw dropper that was. And so I explained to them that nobody saw that coming. Like, there were no spoilers. Like, it wasn't known. And when it happened, and Luke or Darth Vader said he was Luke's father, nobody believed it, of course, because Ben said nothing about it in Star Wars. So why would Ben lie? And Darth Vader is evil, right? So he's going to tell Luke whatever he wants to hear just to get him on his team. And nobody believed it after The Empire Strikes Back. And these guys that I was talking to, they kind of looked interested. So I kept telling them, when you went to a movie back then, there was no internet, there were no spoilers. You had to catch Siskel and Ebert on sneak previews if you wanted any information about a movie, or capture or catch a review in the newspaper about a movie. Like, there was no information out there. So you mostly went to movies back then knowing nothing. And then I started explaining to them that it was a different time, like when I saw Return of the Jedi, I told them, there were novelizations and comic book adaptations of movies that would come out like months, sometimes before the movie was released. And I told them the story how I had read Return of the Jedi, the Marvel comic book adaptation, and how I had read it a month before the movie came out. And after I'd read it, I went to school and I was telling my friends that, Darth Vader really is Luke's father. And nobody would still believe it. People were telling me, no, you know what? They put that comic book out as a distraction or a decoy, just so that no, I'm telling you, I read the comic and he is. And even then, people wouldn't believe me. And so the coworkers I was talking to, they seemed very entertained by these stories because they weren't there. And I was at the perfect age. I was 8 years old when Star Wars came out, and I'm sure that's around the age bracket that George Lucas had intended Star Wars to be for. I was, Trevor and I were simple and impressionable and uncorrupted, and we were right for the pickings. And so Star Wars picked us right up, and I proceeded to tell the coworkers that there were no Star Wars toys until 1978, so we had to make our own, and it was... I just kept going, and I had all these stories, and I thought, wow, these guys are really captivated. I wonder if other people that weren't there would appreciate it. And I wondered if people that were there would appreciate a refresher course. And so at that time, I started just jotting down things that I could remember. It was just sort of like a random, just a bunch of notes. And then when I had all my notes compiled together, I just decided to sit down in January 2023 and just start writing it, and it just kind of flowed.
So you sift through those notes, you put together kind of a chronology. Like, did you start to notice some like thematic things that you return to? Like, because for one thing, I keep coming to the fact that like you had a resistance to things that Trevor would suggest and needed to be kind of like, there was peer pressure applied in order to like convince you, and then finally you would kind of glom onto something and become almost like you're his first convert, and so you become like his most ardent apostle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Trevor introduced me to a lot of life-changing movies. As I mentioned in the book, Raiders of the Lost Ark was an example. The wait for Star Wars Part 3 was 3 years, and I think I was 11 years old at the time. So that's about a third of my lifetime that I'd have to wait. And the mystery, there were so many mysteries and so many open ends from The Empire Strikes Back that waiting that 3 years, it was unbearable, for a kid that age. And then along comes Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Trevor's trying to convince me to go and check that out. But I had no interests. I was actually pissed off at Lucas and Harrison Ford, because I thought you guys should be making Star Wars 3. Instead, what are you doing making a boring love story movie that takes place on boring Earth with no lightsabers and no aliens? I'm not interested in something that takes place in the 1930s. And I was really held a grudge against Harrison Ford and George Lucas for doing that. I felt betrayed. I felt like they should be working on the next Star Wars movie. I had no idea how movies worked, and that they had probably already wrapped up principal photography. I had no idea. I just thought, what are you guys doing? Like, you're cheating. But Trevor again had to coerce me into seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he pestered me the same way he did about Star Wars. You got to go. It's not what we think. There's melting faces, and there's mummies, and there's action. And like I said, in November of 1981, I relented, and he dragged me to the North Star Cinema on Portage, and I was so happy he did, because Raiders of the Lost Ark was a perfect diversion, a perfect distraction to take my mind off Star Wars for a couple of years, because I was heavily infected with Indiana Jones fever after I saw that. We loved it so much that we saw it consecutively every Saturday afternoon after that, right through the winter, right until March. We watched Raiders of the Lost Ark at the North Star every Saturday afternoon. We'd hop on a bus, and it became so routine that we didn't even call each other and say, hey, you want to go see Raiders? We just did it. We just met at the bus stop Saturday morning, went downtown, hung out at the comic books stores until 1 o'clock rolled around, walked over to the North Star. We didn't even talk about doing it. We just did it. It was like automatic pilot. It was the perfect distraction, though, because it did make the time go by fast.
Well, like you said, 3 years between films, at that age, at 11, that's a quarter of your life you're having to wait.
That's exactly it. And it's even worse when you're eight years old and you're waiting for Star Wars Part 2 to come out in 1980. And this is like 1978. 1980, we're going to be in the 1980s? Like, it seems so far away, and it was so unbearable. But thank God Kenner came out with the toy line in 78, and we got the Star Wars Holiday Special. So there was stuff that tied us over, and we had the newsletter from the fan club, the Bantha Tracks, that came out 4 times a year that had news that we couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to see that envelope waiting for me when I came home from school on the kitchen counter with the Star Wars fan club logo in the upper left-hand corner, because you knew that there was going to be some, you were hoping that there was going to be some news on Star Wars Part 2. And that's another reason why I was kind of pissed at Raiders of the Lost Ark, because you get this newsletter, which is pretty much 4 pages of reading. It's like a pamphlet. Sometimes they'd have an insert. So you don't have a lot of room for news in these little pamphlets. And when they would dedicate a page to Raiders of the Lost Ark, I'd be like, well, come on, I want Empire Strikes Back news. I don't care about this. This isn't the Raiders of the Lost Ark fan club. This is the Star Wars fan club. So I held a grudge against Raiders for about a year there before Trevor convinced me to see it.
You mentioned the Kenner toys. Do you think your fandom would have been as passionate had there not been like objects to, either consume or use during those periods between films?
That's a very good question. I wonder. I never thought about that. maybe not. Maybe I wouldn't have been as passionate because those toys allowed us to continue to keep that fire burning. Yeah, and you were constantly making your own adventures with the ships. And as I mentioned in the book, we had a Star Wars club where we would get together and we'd have our own Star Wars world and our own soap opera. So yeah, I wonder. That's a good question. I wonder if the flame would have been as brightly lit without the toys to play with.
Particularly because obviously the films disappear after a time. Like, you're not able to see them during those periods, right? Like, after it leaves the theater, it didn't come back in theaters until before the second trilogy.
Yeah, which terrified me as a kid. And again, I mentioned that in the book that I mean, I Star Wars was just a sickness to me. It was an obsession, and I couldn't get enough of it. And I had to I would clip out every single newspaper listing in the entertainment section, every single one, every single day, and I'd post it on my wall. And in '78, there was a listing that said "held over" on one of the listings, and I asked my mom, like, "What does held over mean?" And she explained to me, "Well, theaters get a movie, and they probably sign a contract to say that they're going to have it for a certain amount of time, and then when that deadline approaches, they have to replace it with another movie. But it looks like Star Wars is being held over, so it looks like they're extending." And I thought, "Well, you mean Star Wars can leave?" And she had to explain that, yeah, like, movies don't stay in theaters forever. There's other movies that have to come out. And I was absolutely terrified that was going to happen because I never thought I'd see it again. So I had to find ways to see it as much as I could, because if it was held over, that meant to me that the end was near. So yeah, every day I would check that newspaper and make sure that Star Wars was still listed in there. And then, of course, the day came where it wasn't on the page anymore, and that was a dark day.
You mentioned the Star Wars Club and, getting together with other folks who had different toys to, create your own stories or try to expand the universe. Do you think, like, your trajectory in terms of making films yourself would have happened without that kind of play?
I think it would have, yeah, because like, that kind of play was just sort of off to the side. It was like a side hobby. But the filmmaker spark had already been ignited in me when I saw the opening. When I saw that, and
the crawl.
Yeah, and how the movie just had the ability to change my existence. And I thought, man, I would love to do that. I would love to make people feel the same way that George Lucas made them feel, and have that same kind of inspiration and motivation to others. And that it was really ignited then. And I had already started writing, like, short stories, and the play was just recreational. I don't think it played much part in my desire to want to make movies.
We talked about the fact that, like, the new trilogy, the 1, 2, 3, kind of reignited things for folks in kind of the popular lexicon. I mean, now at this point, like, Star Wars is ubiquitous, right? I mean, that there's chock-a-block content, and we have now, like, with the most recently the Acolyte, we have a version of the High Republic in these different eras, and those Zahn books have kind of been incorporated into the storytelling with someone like Thrawn entering the Ahsoka thing. Like, did you ever conceive of a world where, like, there was this much Star Wars for you?
No, I was always envious of Star Trek because it was so massive and it was so expanded. And there was always the Trekkies versus the Star Warriors kind of thing going on, and I was kind of envious that, yeah, you guys have more. They got more worlds, they got more stories. And Star Wars was really kind of regulated and limited. And I always was envious for Trekkies for that. But now Star Wars has stepped into that arena, and it has expanded massively too. So if you had told me when I was a kid or a teenager that we would have more movies and have video games and have TV shows, I would have lost my mind. And I'm still grateful for that. Like, I know there's a lot, it's very polarizing. I know there's a lot of vitriol over there, and I try to stay as positive as I can, because I always think back to my 10-year-old self and how I should be grateful that at least there is Star Wars in the world. Some of it's not very good, and some of it's okay. But I accept the fact that I'm grateful that here I am in my 50s. I never, ever in my wildest imaginations would have thought when I was a teenager or when I was a young adult or when I was a husband or a father that Star Wars would still be alive. So I try to maintain a positive attitude even when things don't go the way they probably should in some of the Disney stuff. But I try to see the silver lining and the sunshine for stuff like that.
Well, like you mentioned, when you first saw this, you were 8 years old. You were kind of the perfect target for that original trilogy, in the same way that there was like a lot of people who didn't like episodes 1, 2, and 3, but little kids really, if that was their first Star Wars, glommed onto it.
I see that has come kind of full circle because I know there weren't a lot of fans of the prequels, and I see a lot of those people that grew up with it that were, like you said, the same age that I was when Star Wars affected me. And now they're, for the same nostalgic reasons, praising the prequels, right? And it's because you get them at the right age. And George Lucas, again, in all fairness, Jar Jar Binks was annoying and everything. And the Ewoks were annoying to me in Return of the Jedi because I was 14 years old and I was of the age where I thought I was a cool teenager and I was discovering girls and rock and roll and hanging out with people. And the Ewoks just threw me off. I just thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I can't, but I accepted it because I always had that frame of mind that Star Wars was made for kids. And Jar Jar Binks, when I saw Phantom Menace, he annoyed the hell out of me, but I understood that he had to be there because George Lucas was still making Star Wars for kids.
The book's been out for a little bit. Has there been any responses that have surprised you or any feedback you've heard that you're not expecting?
In regards to the book?
Yes.
No, not really. I'm surprised, actually, that there wasn't any feedback for the chapter where I put together my Star Wars club, because I was really kind of humming and hawing about going ahead with that in such, our social climate nowadays, there's so much politically correctness, but being a naive kid, the word that we used to describe our Star Wars fan club, we had no idea what it meant. We thought it meant we were Star Wars nerds or Star Wars geeks or Star Wars fanatics, but I went ahead and put that chapter in anyways, thinking there might be some backlash, but I've heard nothing, so I'm glad.
Well, there you go. The book, Growing Up Star Wars, is out now. Kevin Doherty, thanks very much for taking some time to talk about it, and congratulations on its release.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I really appreciate it.